Okay, well, shall we get stuck in? It's 3 o'clock. So, we're talking about communicating your brand and your brand vision effectively. And I've brought Tom, the director of 146, to join me today for our afternoon tea.
Hello.
I'm going to be asking, you're going to be answering, and you're going to be asking me some questions back,
I'm
probably.
going to be asking you back. Yeah.
Awesome. About branding, and we're going to try and learn as much as we can in 20 minutes. So, if we start with the basics, how do you experience branding as a consumer and someone who also works in marketing and branding?
Um, so I think most people's experience of a brand when they first come across it is the design elements typically. So the logo, the color scheme, the font. But I think as we know, branding over the last 20, 30 years, maybe longer, has evolved quite a lot. And it's more now about sort of the perception that you have of a brand when you experience it. Um, Maybe some of the language that that brand uses to describe itself and to communicate with its customers, and some of the values perhaps that the brand tries to live by.
Hmm.
So I think branding has sort of changed quite a bit over the last sort of 20, 30 years, to be a lot more than just the design elements.
So when you're shopping, do you think about that, or um, does it completely go out of your mind and you don't think about like the marketing behind a brand or anything when you're shopping, or do you think about
Yeah,
stuff like
sometimes
that?
I do. Yeah, it's difficult. It's difficult to separate it sometimes because obviously in the line of work we're in, you kind of see some of the thinking behind the sort of branding messages.
Yeah,
So you know, you can see the thought process that's going on to kind of hook you in as a customer
yeah.
almost. So yes, I do see some of that, and as I say, as a consumer as well as someone in the world of marketing, it can be difficult to separate the two. What do you think of when you head into a shop? I know you,
I always think about brand.
yeah,
I think my customer service background means that every time I shop, I'm 100% thinking about it from like an
yeah,
analytical perspective. And and I do now I work in marketing, I do try and match up like, is my experience as a customer matching what the brand has told me I should be experiencing as a
yes,
customer?
yeah,
I'm a bit guilty of that. It
yes,
makes
because
it really hard to decide on something sometimes.
yeah, well, brands tell you what bigger brands typically tell you, often tell you what you should think about the brand, but how you feel about it can often be quite different. So
Yeah.
that, yeah, um, the experience that you have of a brand um, can vary quite a lot from, or it can stray quite a lot from what the brand wants you to think of it.
Yeah. So it's much more, it means a lot more than just the logo and the color palette. Um, what do you think when in it from a B2B perspective, or like businesses that aren't like a flashy business, that aren't like retail? What does brand mean beyond the visuals?
Well, I think when a business is first trying to establish itself, the first thing it typically does is, you need to get a logo together. If you're setting up a business, you typically need to get some sort of visual branding together. But there's probably not enough time spent working on how you want your brand to be perceived. I know you're going to come on to a question in a minute about exercises that businesses can go through. But I think a lot of the initial time spent when you're first forming your business should be about trying to understand your audience, your target market. And if you have the luxury of time when you're setting up the business, putting as much time and effort as you can into, what you want that experience to look like, who your audience and your target market is will pay dividends later on, because it's easy to spend a lot of time in those early stages trying to figure out who it is you're trying to sell your products or services to.
Mhm.
And in some cases that's just a learning process. Like you have to start trading and putting yourself out there
Yeah,
to find out that answer. But if you've got the luxury of being able to do as much of that kind of initial research as you possibly can, it will sort of hold you in good stead.
cool.
What do you think?
I think it's quite an emotionally driven concept,
Mm.
branding. And I don't think that maybe enough people think about what emotions they want people to feel when
Uh-huh.
they're thinking of their brand.
Yeah.
And they're not necessarily going to be exciting emotions in B2B, but thinking about those brands more like beyond the visuals and thinking about the emotions, sorry, more
Hmm.
beyond the visuals of how you want people to feel when they think about your brand
Yeah.
is the step beyond that. Um, do you think that's why so many businesses struggle to communicate their brand vision effectively?
Yes, I think a lot of businesses don't spend enough time understanding their audience. I think a lot of the brand, sort of the core brand elements are the why. So why should I buy from your business and not one of your competitors? And I think that's about trying to get your kind of brand story right.
Hmm.
And I think when you listen to a lot of sort of really passionate business owners who, are successful, there's like a bit of a brand story there,
Mm,
and they want to tell it every time you speak to them. And I think a lot of smaller businesses struggle to come up with that brand story, and you know, spending some time thinking about your brand story. How did you come about? What's the story behind why you chose your particular design scheme for your logo? What does it mean? What does the business name mean to you and the people that work at the business?
mm,
That kind of time and effort spent, putting your brand story together can be really quite powerful. And even when you get that brand story right, most of the time it lives in the owner or the founder's head. And
yeah,
the staff members don't necessarily understand the brand story. And so you can't just develop the brand and have it in your head and be able to recite a pitch when you go and see a potential customer. But you should try and spend time and effort explaining and helping your team understand what the brand story is as well.
yes, okay. So we'll get onto that a little bit as in more detail. Um, so can you share a simple exercise, or a question, but a simple exercise that helps businesses get clearer on their brand identity and voice?
Well, it's not an easy task, but and there's no quick win to
No.
this. And if you think about a lot of the most established and recognizable brands, the thing that most of them have got in their favor is longevity. They've been around for a long time,
Yeah,
and they've spent a long time and probably a lot of budget on developing that brand.
yeah,
And they've got, a huge amount of resource to put into customer research and all the rest of it. So, um, there's for a lot of established businesses, they've had the opportunity to gather data about their customers
hmm,
over the course of time. So if you're starting out and you're early on in this process, it can be quite tricky. Um, but you could try a simple exercise, which I would call the 1-3-5 exercise. So one sentence that describes what your business does, um, or describes your brand in one sentence. 3 words that you'd use to describe, so adjectives. It might be honesty or friendliness or something along those lines that describes what your business is about.
hmm,
And then 5 brand promises or
okay,
values, things that you want to live by. So if you're a coffee shop, your promise is locally sourced produce, competitive pricing, whatever it is.
yeah,
So that simple exercise can at least give you a bit of a head start so that you think about how you want your business to be perceived. And in an ideal world, you want to get to a point where your customers become advocates. So if two strangers sat in a room and spoke about your business, how would you want them to describe your business? What would you want
Yeah.
them to say about your business? And that's the end goal. You want to get to the point where they understand what your business stands for, what its values are, and that's probably half the battle of branding.
Yeah, okay. So like taking a step back, thinking about what people are saying about you or what you want them to say about you and looking and going, is that actually what people are saying about me? And
Yes.
if it's not, where am I going wrong? So there's a lot more questions after that. You say, oh, I want these people to call us dependable.
Hmm.
Well, are we actually delivering on that in our customer service experience? Like, is our, are we being analytical enough about how we're getting back to people on time, or are we delivering what we say we're going to deliver? And keep asking yourself why and how and when, even like to get to the very bottom of if if you don't think that what you want people to say about you, it is what they're saying about you,
Yeah.
then you need to do some work like kind of backwards on that to get back to where you've kind of veered off a little bit and get back on track.
Yeah. So I think branding is as much about the experience that people have when they interact with your business as it is about anything else. And um, people's perception of what your brand is ultimately where a lot of the value in your business lies.
Mm,
Because if they think one of your competitors offers something better or cheaper or something that gives them an advantage over your business, then you could argue they have a stronger brand than yours.
yeah.
And I would encourage businesses to, just as I've mentioned previously, spend time thinking about how you want your business or brand to be perceived. And that often by going through that process and kind of digging down and asking those questions that get to the bottom of those answers, you find out what it is you need to do
Okay. Yeah.
to help drive up the value of your brand and give you an advantage over uh, your competition.
So we said earlier that we can't really give any quick wins out because branding isn't a very quick process. But you mentioned making sure you're communicating your vision effectively to the people who are then communicating your vision out.
Mm.
So if there's a disconnect between what you're thinking your vision is, and your brand is, and then how people are actually maybe perceiving it, do you think that having a little bit of work there on your actual own communication skills, or using some tools like even just finding other brands that you admire and you want to kind of emulate a little bit of theirs and sharing those rather than just relying on your own descriptions in your head of what you want something to be like, it was a good way to get started on improving your brand communication?
Yeah, I think I think starting that branding process internally is quite a safe environment to test the water, if you like. So, if you are fortunate enough to have a team of people in a small business where you can spend time going through some branding exercises and you're able to communicate, with the team, or at least try and get some ideas around the team as to how, your brand might be communicated, particularly if you've got people in the team that are interacting with customers on a regular basis.
Hmm.
They're going to have quite a lot of feedback as to how people perceive and experience the brand. So involve those people in that process. You know, Branding doesn't have to be a top-down kind of leadership-led process. A lot of what makes a really great brand is the experience people have, and usually that's with the first point of contact, which is not going to be the owner of the business.
No.
So, if you're able to develop that brand internally, and make use of the people that are experiencing the brand on a day-to-day basis, you, as business owners, you're going to get a lot more insight into, how you might go about changing the way your
Yeah.
brand is perceived. Um,
Or even seeing if it's evolved beyond what you originally thought it was, and now it is actually something different, and whether you're going to go back to what you wanted it to be in the first place, or do you need to change
do you need
to
to do
match what
something
it is
different?
now?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And you know, if you look at brands like, I don't know, maybe Ryanair, for example,
Okay, yeah.
when Ryanair first started out, I mean, I think they've always tried to be, you know, a budget airline. Um, but I think it probably got to the point where it was such a budget airline that, people were making jokes about, you know, you pay money to buy a ticket on a Ryanair flight, and like you go down the extras, and a seatbelt is an extra kind of business.
Yeah, yeah.
Like that perception of the brand is it's
They've
so
really leaned
cheap,
into that, haven't
but
they?
they've kind of leaned into it a
Yeah.
bit because you know, if you want a cheap flight, you know, they're
Yeah.
pretty good for it,
Yeah, and you get what you're given,
you get
and
you get
they're
you
not
get
trying
what
to
you
be
pay for.
anything else,
They're
are
not they're
they?
not trying to be anything different, and the owner of the business is quite sort of buys into that brand and whatever, and he very much tries to be a no frills, cut cost out of the business as much as you can. Um, so they kind of live by that brand, but that is maybe an example of a brand that has evolved a bit and
Mm.
has become slightly different over time. Um, as I say, longevity in business, it gives you an opportunity to evolve, and things have changed obviously so much the last 20 odd years that, if you're not evolving and adapting to technology and new ways of working, then you're going to get left behind. So
Mm.
that evolution of the brand is a kind of a natural process, and um, if you don't go with it, then someone else will.
Cool. Let's see. Wow, that's perfect timing.
Is that 20 minutes? Blimey, that flew by.
That was good. That was excellent timing. Does anyone have any questions to ask based on what? Um, Kyle's put his brand story in.
Cool.
That's pretty interesting. Thanks, Kyle. Thanks for sharing. Um, does anyone have a question that they'd
For
like to
either of us.
ask? Like, we have a minute, we can ask a question, or if you want to send us an email and follow up on this, like we're happy to answer questions off the webinar and go through it in a little bit more detail. But hopefully this has answered some questions. I think a lot of people also have a very different idea of what branding is. Everyone's a bit different. Sometimes some people will think of a brand vision and voice, and some people have a different idea of what it means to them.
It's quite difficult to talk about branding because it's quite abstract.
Yes.
So it's difficult to pin it down. It's such a subjective topic
Yeah.
that, like, well, as this webinar is probably testament to, it's easy to waffle on. So
Yeah, that's
it's
true.
difficult to really pin it down. But yeah, hopefully there's an exercise in there that can give people a bit of a steer on trying to develop their brand and be a bit more articulate about what their brand is.
Thanks for joining us. Um, Kyle says, thank you.
No problem.
Cool. Thanks, Kyle. That's really, I'll read that back in a little bit, Kyle. Thanks for sharing. Thank you, everyone. Have a lovely rest of your afternoon, and we'll see you in a
Thank
couple of
you.
weeks for the next one. Bye.
See you soon. Bye.